For thousands of years, the history of Italy and Greece have been intertwined, often in violent ways, as the two civilizations have fought over coveted Mediterranean territory, including islands big and small. Just as a historical reminder of that fact is that on the Italian island of Sicily, there are more Greek temples than there are in Greece itself. And in the very southern part of the Italian boot, there are still remnants of Greek-speaking communities. That fierce Greek-Italian rivalry took another bitter, violent turn at the start of World War II, when Italian dictator Benito Mussolini teamed up with German Chancellor Adolf Hitler and mercilessly pursued his own imperialist dream to rebuild some of the Roman Empire by invading Albania, Greece, and Yugoslavia, among others. In the case of Greece, the upshot of this foolhardy Mussolini megalomania led to a chapter of bitter relations with Greece, some of which has either been covered up or papered over because both quickly became post-World War II Cold War allies and subsequently NATO and European Union members. But if you spend time studying this pre, present, or post-World War II Italian and Greek story, you find enough drama, tragedy, and even pathos to fill a few books. A man who has undertaken just such a task over the years to put all the pieces of the Greek and Italian World War II puzzle together is Paolo Fonzi. Paolo is a professor of history at the University of Napoli. He's written various books on the Balkan World War II story, including on Greece. And Professor Paolo Fonzi was also a fellow at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. These days, Professor Paolo Fonzi is also considered an expert on what has become known as memory politics, or as I like to refer to it, revisionist history, as politicians, mostly from the far right, but also on the far left, have twisted the reality of some chapters of World War II to conveniently suit their brand of populist politics. So, Paolo, welcome to the podcast. While the Greek army was in North Africa and then Italy, the AMLS resistance group received significant help from the British Special Operations Executive, or the SOE. And this included weapons, and that started as early as 1943. So when the Nazi German army pulled out of its occupation of Greece in 1944, the British turned around and had to send troops, including in an Indian division, to try to stop the Greek communist AMLS fighters in their efforts to take over the government. And that was the beginning of what would become a 3-year civil war in Greece after World War II. So has there ever been retrospective considerations or doubts about whether it would have been better to have sent more Greek army troops to Greece instead of Italy to fight on the Gothic Line offensive? And had they sent more Greek troops to Greece and Athens, might it prevented the ensuing post-World War II Greek Civil War?
Well, this is a very good question. Although actually some Greek troops were indeed sent to Greece on liberation in October 1944 when the Germans pull out of the country. And that's especially units of the Greek army in exile, namely the 3rd Mountain Brigade, so it's called Rimini Brigade because they had actually fought in Rimini in Italy, and then the so-called Sacred Squadron, Ieroslochos in Greek. So the Greek army in exile has a very complex and interesting history because many soldiers staged mutiny in different occasions. One very large one was in April 1944. And these mutinies were motivated by the fact that many soldiers were left-leaning, and they regarded also with suspicion the Greek government in exile and the king himself, so the monarchy, as being illegitimate. So because especially when in Greece, Eamelas, so the leftist resistance spread all over Greece and controlled much of Greece, establishing even a government, a sort of alternative government to the collaborationist one in Athens in 1944. So in the eyes of many Greek soldiers, these mutinies were against actually the government, but the British actually sent British force to put down these mutinies. And after that, there was a huge purge of this leftist element within the army. So when the Greek forces were actually sent to Greece in 1944 to liberate the country, they were reliable anti-communist forces in the eyes of the British. So they could be relied upon in order to prevent a communist coup. What actually brought the first episode of civil war in December 1944 was actually the very fact that the Greek government wanted the resistance fighters to hand over the weapons they had used as resistance fighter during the war. Many of these weapons came actually from the British themselves, from the SOE. And so they refused handing over the weapons because they feared an anti-communist takeover in the country, but also because they saw that the British forces integrated the former collaborators of the Germans into the Greek police forces and into the National Guards that were formed in that very moment. So this power vacuum created by the retreat of the German forces in 1944 and this very short period of reorganization of the Greek government led to the December 1944 uprising in Athens and the clashes between Eamelas and the British.
So, as I mentioned, and as you just alluded to, there were both British and Indian Army troops. They were sent to Greece from Italy in early 1945 in an effort to quell this outbreak of civil war and prevent the communist LS resistance group from taking over the country. So how did that actually play out once they arrived?
Well, actually, so British forces landed in 1944 or already massively in 1945, but actually what led to the outbreak of the civil war was first and foremost the mutual suspicion between the parties. So the British feared a communist takeover. So because the EAMLA was dominated by the Greek Communist Party, and the resistance took control of most of the countries. So the liberated areas in August or September 1943, before the Italians actually signed the armistice, were in central Greece. So it was a very wide freed area by the leftist resistance, and they even held secret elections in 1944. So they really established a sort of new state, new institutions in the liberated area. So there was a lot of concern about the leftist resistance taking power after the war. On the other side, so the leftist resistance was so very preoccupied, so very concerned about first the reintegration of former collaborators, but also so by the fact that the British wanted to bring back the king from exile. And this was also, I would say, completely out of date, because in the occupation years, the country had moved towards new political and democratic awareness among the population, especially in the liberated areas where the EAMLAs had established really new institutions like people's tribunals in small villages. So this kind of grassroots democracy established by the resistance forces clashed completely with the idea of bringing back the old system, the old regime that had been responsible of establishing the dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas in 1936. So this was also something that was a very debated issue among the government in exile, the British and the resistance forces throughout the occupation. And this also was one of the causes of the mutual suspicion between the two forces that led to the Cambriana, the so-called December 1944 clashes in Athens between the Hellas, the British and the Greek government forces on the other side. And then actually it is a bit more complicated. So because in the first months of 1945, an agreement was reached between the two parties, the two resistance fighters and the government and the British, the so-called Barkisa agreement, when actually EAMLA's fighters handed over the weapons. After that, a long period of so-called white terror ensued, where former collaborators and anti-communist forces in the country targeted with violence in a very systematic way former resistance fighters. And then this led actually in 1946 to the outbreak of a full-fledged civil war with the formation of the Greek Democratic Army in the north, so the Communist Army in the north, fighting against government forces, and then backed first by the British and then by the US.
So was there cooperation between Italian communist partisans, Tito's communist partisans, and the LMLS resistance fighters?
Well, there were different forms of cooperation. In most cases, you have cooperation at the border areas. So, for example, northern Greece, Macedonia, there were contacts between the MLS forces and Tito's communist partisans. Then you have also in the Yugoslav Italian case, you have like cooperation between the Garibaldi units of the communist formations of the Italian resistance and Tito's partisans. Then also another form of cooperation, which is quite interesting, because in September 1943, many Italian soldiers that were garrisoning the areas of occupied Yugoslavia, like Albania and Greece, some of them, instead of surrendering to the Germans, they actually decided to join the resistance fighters. This happened in Albania, this happened in Greece as well, but it was a failure in this case. And then it happened also in Montenegro, in the region of Yugoslavia. And this means also that in that case, in Montenegro, the Tito's partisans decided actually to create a special unit of Italian soldiers of the Royal Army occupying the country, but now resistance fighters alongside the Yugoslav parties. And they cooperated actually with partisans. They fought in Yugoslavia and not in Italy. So besides cooperation, there are also many instances of conflicts, especially over border regions, like, for example, Macedonia, that was actually coveted by both resistance organizations and parties. So both communist parties, so by Tito, who wanted to create a sort of independent state of Macedonia, and the Greek communists who wanted to actually keep Macedonia within the Greek borders, Greek Macedonia within the Greek borders. The same happened also in Italy, where actually Tito wanted to annex as much as possible of the Venezia Giulia, and this created tensions between the two communist resistance movements.
Well, we're going to have a special episode series on the issue of the borderland story between Venezia Giulia and especially the story of Trieste and Gorizia, which is certainly the start of the Cold War before even the Hot War was over. But in any case, that's coming up. So I want to ask you now, amongst this cooperation between the communist groups and the resistance groups of the different countries, what was the role that the Soviet Union played amongst them? As obviously they were the leaders in the communist movement.
Well, actually, as for the MLS fighters in Greece, not much help came from the Soviet Union because of different reasons. But in 1944, especially when the so-called percentage agreement was signed between Churchill and Stalin, then Greece fell within the Western sphere of influence, which means actually that Stalin sort of gave up Greece, not as part of this sphere of influence. So the Left Communist Party in Greece also during the Civil War received little help from the Soviet Union. Stalin even wanted to actually to prevent that civil war because it ran counter his geopolitical view. But actually most of the help to the left army fighting the civil war after the Second World War came actually from Yugoslavia, from Tito, rather than from Stalin. This stopped when the Stalin-Tito split occurred in 1948, and this failure of Tito's supply to the Greek resistance was one of the reasons why the Democratic Army, the Communist Army that was fighting the Greek Civil War, actually lost the war because Tito decided in 1948 to seal the border that from where actually the Greek communist fighters got their support for Tito.
So that brings me to another communist related question, especially vis-a-vis Italy. So did the violent divisions between the British and the Greek ALS resistance fighters, what you mentioned already started in 1944, did that influence the way the British government was thinking about the communist partisans that they were helping at that time in Italy? We know that there was maybe late 44, 1945, there was all of a sudden a concern amongst the British that possibly a post-World War II scenario in Italy could end up with a communist government, because actually the Communist Party in Italy, I think at the time, was the second largest in Western Europe. So how much did the Greek situation influence the British thinking about what was going on in Italy with the partisans?
Well, this is also very interesting because actually the Greek specter, so the idea that Italy could end up being a second Greece, was actually very much present in the minds of the British and the Allies, so more generally. And this led actually in fall 1944 to the Allies deciding to limit as much as possible the drops of support for the Italian partisans, especially the Italian Garibaldi brigades, so the communist units within the Italian resistance. And in November 1944, this was also the so-called Alexander Proclamation. So the commander, General Alexander, the commander of the Middle East headquarters, and he actually asked the Italian resistance to refrain from large-scale operation and cease high-profile attacks against Germans and fascist forces, and to take a sort of defensive posture, to wait for the winter and to wait for liberation by the regular armies of the Allies that were actually slowly but ceaselessly liberating Italy. So the Greek specter had a huge impact, I would say, on the relations between the Allies and the Italian resistance. Also, on the other side, I would say the idea that Italy might slip into a civil war like Greece was also very much present. So the Italian resistance fighters were also very much aware of that danger. And so this led them actually to accept the handing over of weapons after the liberation of Italy. So it was one of the reasons why actually they accepted, unlike the Greek resistance fighters, handing over weapons.
So what role did the OSS, the American OSS, and then later the CIA play in the Greek Civil War? And how did that impact the Cold War that intensified in the years after World War II, up until the point where the British and Churchill actually drew up a plan for a possible attack on the Soviets? And that plan was called unthinkable, just because it was unthinkable that there could be another hot war after horrors of World War II. So how much did the secret services of both the British and the Americans play?
Well, that is also very important. The SOE and the Office of Strategic Services, so the American OSS, they actually played both an important role during occupation, and then after that, the CIA was involved in supporting the Greek government after the war, so during the Civil War. So when actually the Truman Doctrine was crystallized in 1947, that actually led the American government to support massively the Greek government during the Second World War, especially after the British retreat of forces during the Civil War. So Greece was one of the very motivations that led to the establishment of the Truman Doctrine in 1947.
Well, I guess there's irony there, because I read in Churchill's biography by Max Hastings, he described how Americans were very critical of Churchill in 1945 when troops were fighting with the Greek resistance fighters. So then all of a sudden, a year later, the Americans were basically taking up the fight.
Well, actually, yeah. So the Cold War changed a lot. So the American attitude towards the Greek internal conflicts, and so this is indeed a very good point. It is a watershed, I would say.
So moving on now, when World War II ended, Italy obviously had some debts to pay to Greece after Mussolini had invaded. So was Italy ever required to pay war reparations to Greece because of the invasion by Mussolini?
Indeed, in 1947, Italy signed a peace treaty with different countries, Albania in 1939, Greece in 1940, and Yugoslavia in 1941. And it committed itself to pay to Greece 105 million US dollars in reparation, which was then paid actually to the Greeks, as opposed to Germany that never actually signed a peace treaty. And this helped Germany to escape the issue of reparations for many years, which is still very hot today. Italy paid some of the reparation, although the amount of reparation was very much below Greek expectations in 1947, but actually it was something.
At the same time, though, there was no Italian military or Italian government officials held accountable for war crimes that occurred when Mussolini launched his invasion into Greece, and there were civilian massacres by his troops. Why was there no persons or military officials who carried out these war crimes held accountable?
Well, actually, in 1943, the United Nations War Crimes Commission was set up by the Allied forces, and they started gathering evidence about war crimes committed by the Axis forces. And they gathered a lot of information from the Greeks as well, that had established after liberation in 1944, the Greek National Office for the Prosecution of War Crimes committed in Greece during occupation. This office transmitted evidence gathered in Greece to the United Nations. On this basis, requests of surrender of war criminals to be tried in Greece were addressed to Italy. And Italy was able to escape them because the Allies were disinclined to have many Italians trialed in Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia. So it was actually the idea that although Italy had lost the war and then had fought on the German side, was a sort of minor ally. So during the Cold Wars, the idea was that Italy was now an ally in the fight against communism. So all these factors, also the Greek unwillingness to really prosecute Italians for war crimes, led in 1948 the Greek government to sign a secret deal with the Italian government, where actually they gave up prosecution of Italian war criminals in Greece. This was a secret deal because the Greek public opinion was fiercely against any surrender on this issue. There was within the public opinion very strong current wanting war crimes prosecuted. So a number of trials were done in Greece of Italians. These were people that were not surrendered by Italy to Greece, but were captured in Greece because they were still there on the liberation. And one of them, for example, was an officer stationed in the north, in Western Macedonia, in the town of Castoria, and he was Giovanni Ravalli. He was actually captured by the resistance, then handed over to the Greek government forces, and then tried. And there was a lot of news in the Greek newspaper at that time. It was a very important public event. So Giovanni Ravalli was actually sentenced to a number of years in prison, but he was actually freed on Italian prompting a couple of years after that. So he returned to Italy. And this was what happened to most of the open cases that were dealt with by the Greek government. So most of these people went back to Italy. So justice actually never took place, although the Greek government tried to have the Italian government or the Italian tribunals trying the people that were singled out by the Greeks as criminals. And the Italians in the beginning actually promised they would do that, but then in the end, Cold War and then Italian sovereignty fully restored after the war. That never happened.
Another key World War II issue that involves Greece and Italy revolves around the German slaughter of more than 3,000 Italian soldiers on the Greek island of Cephalonia after the September 1943 Italian armistice. And that's when basically Italy changed sides in the war. And then the Italian soldiers who were fighting alongside the Germans were legally their enemy. And that tragedy has evolved in the last 25 years into an historical event that has had significant impact on post-World War II relations between Italy and Greece, as well as Italy and Germany. So first off, there have been some voices in Italy that have cast indirect blame on LS fighters for the deaths of some of those Italian soldiers because they claimed the Greek resistant fighters did not come to the aid of the Italian soldiers on Cephalonia. So can you tell us a little bit more about this complicated story?
Well, there are actually two strands, I would say, of discussion on this issue in regard to the relations between the Italian Acqui division that actually resisted the Germans in 1943 and was then afterwards massacred by the German forces, and the local Hellas fighters, the local left-wing resistance. So the first strand, I would say, is a sort of Greek local memory. Until, I would say, 1973, when the real democratization of Greece took place after the dictatorship that lasted from 67 to 73, when actually the Greek leftist resistance was rehabilitated in Greece. Until then, there were many books and sort of local memory, conservative anti-communist memory, that actually blamed Hellas fighters for pushing the Italians into not surrendering to the Germans, but to fighting with the Germans. And this is something that has been sort of reversed in the 80s, when this sort of rehabilitation of Eam in the Greek public memory took place. Then the predominant discourse in Greece became right the opposite, that Hellas and the Italian soldiers had actually formed the first international resistance, fighting together against the Germans. So you have these two completely different stages of memory in Greece. First, an anti-Hellas one, and then a pro-Hellas one, and the Italian fought together against the Germans. And this kind of memory is still alive today in Greece. Then you have an Italian discussion of this. And there has been in many publications a discussion about why the Allies failed to send support to the fighting Italian soldiers. This may have allowed them to resist the Germans. And so there has been, in the 50s, drawing on a series of publications in Greece, a huge discussion about the role of a Greek liaison officer, so between the SOE and the Italian forces in Cephalonia. He said actually in a number of articles in a Greek newspaper that he had been sent to the commanding generals of the Acqui division, Generale Antonio Gandin, and he asked him if he was prepared to resist the Germans and not to surrender to them. So the idea was actually to bring the information to the Allies and asking them for help if the Italian division was actually able to or willing to oppose resistance. In that early stage, right after the armistice, the 8th of September 1943, General Gandin was rather disinclined towards resisting the Germans. According to many sources, was a pro-German officer, and he wanted actually to surrender. But most of the soldiers of the division were in favor of fighting. So there was even an internal referendum where actually the Italian soldiers voted in favor of fighting against the Germans. So when Gandhi said, no, I don't want to resist, then the Allies decided to let the Italian soldiers to their fate, so not actually caring about their fate. And also the Allies were fighting in Italy at that time. They diverting forces to support a tiny division on Greek soil was not reasonable. And also now recently there has been a book by Elena Agarossi, an Italian historian. She says actually, based on English sources, that in 1943 there was the fear among the Greek government in exile that Italians might want to keep the islands after the war, because during the occupation, the Italians had tried, unlike the rest of Greece, they had tried to annex the Ionian Islands to Italy directly to make it part of Italy. And so there was the fear that the Italian might use their military presence on the island to keep them after the war. So this may have been one of the reasons for the failure of Allied support to the Acqui division.
So do you know, has there been any declassified documents in recent years that shed more light on that story? Whether or not the Allies actually...
Well, not really. So I would say that everything is accessible. All the records on this issue have been accessible for years now. So nothing new can come out of the archives in terms of declassified documents. But actually, Elena Agarossi saw previously documents that had not been used previously by other historians. And actually, something new may come from Greek sources if they were completely accessible. What could be very interesting would be to see Eamelas documents related to the Cephalonia massacre, but many of the documents are stored by the Greek Communist Party, and these are not accessible, most of them.
So another very interesting development that evolved over the post-World War II years about the Cephalonia massacre is that after the war ended, essentially the Italian government buried the story of what happened on the island of Cephalonia. And in fact, it ended up, as you had referred to, in what is known as the Cabinet of Shame in the Ministry of Defense, with the buried details of a host of other massacres that were carried out in Italy by the German and Italian fascist troops in northern Italy and other parts of the country. And these include the infamous massacre at Sant'Anna di Stazzema in Tuscany and one in Marzabotto in Romagna, where hundreds of civilians were murdered in cold blood. And the post-World War II Italian government, they buried all those cases over concerns that if they pursued him, it would dredge up details of the civilian massacres carried out by Italian troops when Mussolini's fascist army invaded Albania, Yugoslavia, and Greece, as I had mentioned earlier. However, in the past 25 years, Italian politicians and others have reframed the Cephalonia story as a way to rehabilitate Italy's World War II dark story. And they have actually championed the murdered Acquis Division soldiers on Cephalonia who refused German orders as the first act of Italian resistance against Hitler in World War II. And you alluded a little bit to this in your previous answer. For some, this narrative is revisionist history. So, Paolo, can you explain why this reframing of the Cephalonia story is problematic for many historians in Italy and Greece and elsewhere?
Well, I would say it is just a little bit more complicated than that, because in the beginning, right after the war, Italy's try actually to bring up the instance of the Acquis Division. So, for example, during the talks for the peace treaty, because at that stage, Italy wanted to show that it had been, since the very beginning, since September 1943, had been fighting for the Allied cause. And in order to erase or to discount the previous partating with the German allies, the Mussolini regime, in order to whitewash this previous story, it was so very convenient for the Italians to talk about Cephalonia, because it was resistance on the Allied side, and it was also something made by the regular army, which is more in line with the idea of rehabilitating Italy as a nation. Then came a long phase of oblivion in Italian memory, and then I would say this kind of reframing, so very strong in recent years. And so, for example, in 2000, Italian President Carlo Azeglio Ciampi went to Cephalonia for the yearly celebration, and he held a speech where he stressed the contribution given by the Acquis Division to the European resistance. So there is actually this sort of line. Then on the other hand, so there is the issue of justice. And this is a completely different thing, because actually Italy in the first years used the memory of the massacre of the Acquis Division in order to be rehabilitated on one side, but on the other hand, it wanted to be integrated into the Western camp during Cold War. And Germany was now an ally in the Cold War. And it was now inconvenient to bring up the issue of the German war crimes. Also, as you rightly say, because the Italians feared if Italy had brought up the issue of German war crimes in Italy and against Italians in Greece, this might have actually led the Greeks and the Yugoslavs and the Albanians to ask for extradition of Italian war criminals to their country. So all these reasons led to the so-called Cabinet of Shame, the Armadio della Vergogna, that was actually forgotten in a basement in the Palazzo Cesi in Rome for decades after that, in order not to be seen by people and to be so completely forgotten, and in order for it to disappear. Where actually more than 600 files related to war crimes made by the Germans in Italy were stored and when discovered in 1994. And this led also to two trials against two former German soldiers who had been involved in the massacres. And these files were found in the cabinet of shame. So, as you rightly say, the idea that it was resistance or the first act of resistance done by the Italians is strongly used by the military because it was something not done by insurgents, but it was done by a unit of the regular army. And that has been also part of the reshaping of the Italian memory after the fall of the so-called Italian First Republic. So the instance of the Acqua division may be understood as resistance, although it is, as I say, quite problematic because so we don't really know what the motivations of the soldiers were because many of them or some of them just wanted to go home. I mean, Cefalonia was very close to Italy. It would have been easy for them to be brought back home. And this was an understandable motivation. It's not necessarily bound up with a sort of political idea of resistance.
Well, Paolo, thank you very much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to having further conversations with you on these very pertinent and topical memory politic issues, as they're known, or revisionist history issues. So thanks again.
Thank you, Joe.